All right, good afternoon, everybody. I think we're going to come back from the break and kick off the next panel. I don't know if I should stand up or just stay seated today. We got a great panel this afternoon focused on a range of aspects of international acquisition. To my immediate left, we have Dr. Jerry McGinn from George Mason University. Jerry has got a paper along with Michael T. Radke on developing a build-allied approach to increasing industrial base capacity. To his left is Nate Picarsic with a paper on investing in great power tech competition, early-stage deep tech investment. And online, we're privileged to have with us Dr. Kogila Balakrishnan. And if I got that right, I'm happy I got it right. It's great to have you with us, ma'am. With a paper on competition versus sole sourcing in defense. What are the factors that determine value for the money? I think I might have shortened that title just a bit, but she'll be our third speaker this afternoon. So hopefully you're getting some great questions together for all three of our great panelists, and you've had an opportunity to read their papers. I think this is an incredibly interesting topic. I'm Lieutenant General Dave Bassett. I'm the director of the Defense Contract Management Agency. I manage the team of trusted professionals that deliver value across the acquisition lifecycle to our warfighters across this country and around the world. So we have a very large international mission. And so we have the opportunity to be in the plants at various locations, leveraging the global supply chain in support of the department, and also helping to surveil for our allies and partners throughout that process. And so we get a firsthand, front row view to a lot of those international challenges. As I looked at this set of papers, I think it presents a pretty interesting range of challenges, really starting with the need for us to protect American innovation and ensure that our adversaries, or I'll say unfriendly nations, would not be able to exploit that military technology that really should be available only to our forces and our allies. And so Nate's paper really goes into the Chinese way of making investment and how that affects our concerns around limiting the sharing of our technology, and how their business model, which I think he described very accurately as state-led, enterprise-driven, the way that they have really no boundary condition between their defense industry and their government, and how that gives them certain advantages within the defense space. I'll say all the way to the other side of this, which is, we can't succeed in this unsafe world without allies and without partners and without leveraging the industrial capacity of other nations to deliver the capabilities that our nation needs. I think we've had a really strong reminder over the last year or so, as for maybe the first time since the Second World War, we've seen a conflict that could be limited by industrial capacity. The rate at which defense material is being consumed in Ukraine, both by the Russian army and their Wagner counterparts, as well as by the Ukrainian army and those who seek to defend their freedoms in Ukraine, the rate at which defense material is being consumed exceeds the capacity both of the Russian defense industrial capacity, as well as that of the United States, the Ukraine, and other allies. And so the question then becomes, what can we do to expand capacity? How much additional capacity should we pay for during peacetime, knowing that once the balloon goes up, that is not the time to try to add capacity, because that certainly doesn't happen in an operationally relevant time frame. So from how do you protect your technology all the way to how do you leverage allies to finally, from a contracting perspective, do you do that? And particularly, I think for allies, do you do that building your own or with a partner, or with a sole source contract because of the volumes that you might have in your country, or do you go to full and open competition? And what are the advantages and disadvantages around that decision for both for the United States as well as for our allies and partners? And I think, a lot of times, how effective we are in this space is all about asking the right questions. And that question about sole source versus full and open competition is one that we ought to explore beyond just the legal limitations of what we're asked to do here in the United States. So I'm excited about some great papers, and I'd like to make some room for the team to go ahead and present. So I'm going to turn it over to Nate Picarsic.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you all for taking the time to join the presentations and the dialogue. Excited to be alongside an esteemed set of panelists and experts, and excited to run through a presentation as quickly as possible so we can get to the important questions that you all may have. In previous iterations of this symposium, our research team has done work unpacking the definitional sort of foundation of China's military civil fusion program, as General explained, the combination of and lack of a division between the civilian and the military in terms of acquiring technology on the part of the People's Liberation Army. We've also dug into the R&D trends of how China allocates its resources. In comparison, contrasts very starkly with the American approach, where China invests very low shares of their R&D funding into early stage science and technology. They have confidently sat downstream and waited for innovation to be developed abroad and harvested foreign innovation either through licit or illicit means. Those themes have sort of been in the drinking water now for a while, and slowly our acquisition system is catching up to the reality of China's positioning. So this year, as we sort of move into hopefully being more proactive and orienting around the importance of commercial technology, we've dove into the concept of deep technology and the private sector venture capital investment flows that support the development of an application of science and technology in the hard technology or quote unquote deep tech sectors that matter for defense acquisition, and focusing on the Chinese perspective. So here we have a graphic on the first slide that helps to frame this concept of deep tech from the Chinese perspective. The technological areas that are highlighted from both governmental and private sector sources in China are consistent largely with Western definitions of quote-unquote deep tech, as well as the strategic emerging industries that have been codified over the past, say, 15 years in Chinese industrial policy. So those cover everything from AI and biotech to advanced manufacturing and advanced materials. These fields clearly are a part of the commercial suite of technology that both Western sources and Chinese sources have identified as increasingly relevant for great power competition, both in terms of acquisition and in terms of concepts of operation that are deployed on the battlefield. We don't have to look further than seeing DJI drones all over the battlefield in Ukraine to realize the immediate reality of the importance of these flows of capital and technology, but they're relatively new in terms of how they're treated in the defense acquisition system. There's a lot of work being done in the United States to orient around bringing commercial solutions quicker, bringing non-traditional players into the industrial base, and we're hopeful that those efforts can balance the reality of how China's positioned. But as the introduction highlighted, a big part of China's positioning, as reflected in R&D spending, consistent in how their private sector investors act, is focused on harvesting technology from abroad and applying and scaling it quicker within the Chinese system. Some foundational framing that deep tech is a critical force shaping the US-China tech competition as it concerns defense acquisition, but also more broadly the economic development piece of the importance of frontier technologies. R&D trends, government spending less, private sector spending more over time. We're roughly familiar with those trends. Same with the reality of commercial technology in the wake of the ITRMA and proliferation of information technology more broadly have more importance on the battlefield today than they may have in the last great power showdown that the United States faced against the Soviet Union. China's built its acquisition system and its broader economy very well for these trends. So the entire concept of this state-led, enterprise-driven model is much more dynamic and fluid than the command control Soviet model that they learned from, but also benefits from the centralization of pools of capital, the capacity for the government to identify trends and seize on them, and the fact that China is able to sit downstream of technology if we don't defend it and protect it. So if they are able to continue that model, the playbook that they have kind of solves for the weaknesses that the Soviet system, and in particular the Soviet defense acquisition system, brought upon itself. And as innovations increasingly commoditize, we see the potential that the private sector capital flows in deep tech, hard technology fields may become increasingly determinative, if not at least more important, in the balance of the US-China technology competition. China's model focuses on both sending its companies out into the world to acquire technology and also using the lure of the Chinese market to bring in overseas sources of technology. This is true in broadly commercial realms. It's also alarmingly true in defense industrial base, which there's growing awareness of this. I still have a sense and concern that the degree to which our industrial base is both dependent on inputs from China and exposed to revenue and production in mainland China is yet to be fully incorporated into our acquisition system. And the overarching point here is that we competed against the Soviet Union in this type of acquisition competition, long-term peacetime competition, but the Soviets very much contain themselves. China does not. Their strategy's been informed by and learned from the Soviet collapse, and as it concerns defense acquisition, has been sharpened for both the competitive reality and technological reality of where innovation happens today. As we dive into looking at the so-called deep tech field, we think that China looks further ahead than they generally are recognized in other sort of metrics of technological development. Important caveat here being that we're talking about looking at private sector capital flows into technology that's proven and being commercialized and applied. So this could appear to be in contrast with the overall R&D model where China isn't spending early stage, but these are sort of investments that they're placing that help to solve for the fact that they don't invest from a governmental perspective in early stage R&D and would fall outside of what we would consider R&D dollars in our defense acquisition system. One metric that we look at is tallying up the so-called unicorns in the US and Chinese startup lands. The US has an absolute advantage, so our tech market is much bigger. We have many more of these unicorns that are startups valued, private companies valued at $1 billion or more. But the share of those that are focused on deep tech, hard tech, things that are more directly relevant to defense acquisition programs is much lower. So China's absolute number is, shy of 200 startups that meet this metric, but 40% of them are in deep tech fields that have relevance to defense acquisition. The comparable figure for the United States would be something that's lower than 25%. So much of our innovative capacity in the private sector and market cap is captured by software businesses that aren't necessarily solving problems directly relevant to the acquisition system. That's further compounded, China's positioning, by the different tools that they use to continue to acquire technology and remain engaged. So it's not just the direct of what's happening in terms of Chinese investment in the Chinese venture ecosystem. It's also the fact that China has invested very aggressively into the companies and funds in the United States that are potentially relevant to the defense acquisition system in the commercial sphere. So even when we think about the 25% of our startup unicorns that are defense relevant deep tech companies, a majority of those are somehow tied through informational rights to pools of Chinese capital and depend on Chinese production or the Chinese market. And to go one step further, the Chinese approach also invests into the private sector funds, investment funds in the United States that then invest. So they have a lattice of means for having access to information and the U.S. ecosystem that's going to be difficult to, one, monitor, and then all the more to actually protect against. All that then, in turn, compounded by the fact that they've developed a national level strategy of military civil fusion that actually does translate the acquisition of technology and IP from abroad to military and strategic utility. So what do we do about this? Our paper advances some very high-level thoughts that are sort of outside of the scope of concrete acquisition recommendations, but certainly suggests some that may follow. And the most core is figuring out ways to defend our technology, our ecosystems that are most relevant in the immediate, defend our supply lines that have direct relevance for the way that we deter vis-a-vis China, and not as much of a central focus within the deep tech piece, but the reality that China is very well aware of its stranglehold over critical supply lines means that our capacity to deter and position and maneuver in peacetime competition is much more limited than I think generally accepted, and then ultimately develop new public-private modes to actually harvest the fruit of private sector investment flows, both in the United States and among allied and partner audiences, as we'll dive into later on in the panel. To wrap up and move on, private market capital flows are relatively new, so the type of venture investing, private equity investing that we focused on didn't really exist during the Cold War. It's been refined and matured as an asset class just over the past few decades, really, and that means that data and awareness of the relevance for these fields to defense acquisition is also relatively new. All that notwithstanding, China's positioned well, but America does have strengths in terms of technological market, in terms of absolute flows of capital, absolute strength of innovation, but requires a promote and a protect increase moving forward to actually apply pressure on China and take advantage of our natural strengths. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nate. So now it's a pretty abrupt shift, right? So we go from, the risk of U.S. innovation and technology being transferred overseas and strengthening our adversaries to the opportunities that come from the participation in a global market in concert with our allies. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Jerry McGinn and the team and your team from George Mason University.
Great.
Over to you.
All right, thanks. So first, I want to give a shout out to my co-author, Mike Roche, who's in the audience here. Mike is a visiting fellow with us in the center. He comes from DAU as his full-time job. He's been with us here for, he's going to be here with us for almost 6 months. But all the good stuff, all the good analysis, all the good conclusions in this paper are the result of his work, and all the stuff you disagree with, you can blame me. So he did a tremendous job. It was an honor to work with Mike on this one. So, So this paper, Dr. LaPlante talked about it this morning, all right? The situation in Ukraine has demonstrated the need for surge capacity, that we need to produce more. And building domestic capacity is an important component of it, but it's not the only path. The National Defense Strategy, does anyone have any idea how many times partners or allies are mentioned in the National Defense Strategy? All right, 32. 32 times partners and allies are mentioned in the NDS, okay? But the challenge is that hand-waving on that partners and allies has been done for many years in terms of allies and partners are important. It's in the national security strategy. You go back administration. So how do we actually do that? So that's our basic research question is, how can DoD develop an effective build-allied approach to create surge capacity, industrial resilience, and support the national defense strategy? And this is not just about international acquisition. This is about, acquisition and production. all right, as we'll get into. So how do we get after this? So our approach was to, define the components of this build allied approach, and we looked at the enablers and then the obstacles that on the way to reaching that objective. And then we looked at 9 case studies to see, where we've done well, where we've done not so well, and then we make some conclusions and recommendations. So unfortunately, for those of you who have suffered through the paper, I totally disregarded the 20-page limit, and so if you want to read a lot, you're welcome to read the report, but we'll publish it separately as a report later. But the bottom line up front is that many of the components for this, what we call a build ally approach, are already in place. All right. And by increasing U.S. production and engaging industrial capacity in a meaningful way with our partners and allies, we get a very much a win-win scenario of a mutually beneficial and cost-effective approach. So, all right, so what do I mean by build allied? So the objective of what I call it a build allied approach is to create a larger industrial base through international industrial partnerships and collaboration to build the systems needed for today's and tomorrow's contingencies. This creates more industrial capacity that supports both American and allied capabilities to scale and strengthen production of existing and future systems. This will also help us increase the rate of production and reduce supply chain vulnerabilities to create that we've seen the challenges in stockpiles during periods of high operational demand. All right, so the components. Some of these these are all things that exist today. U.S. subsidiaries. There are many non-U.S. headquarters companies that have subsidiaries in the U.S. And some of them do classified work, and they cleared subsidiaries. And there are also companies that just bring their tech from overseas to support U.S. programs. You have co-development programs, co-production. And we're going to get into some of the cases that talk about this. Second sourcing or licensed production, where you're using establishing another line in an allied or partner country. And then sustainment. Sustainment, as many of you all know, is 2/3 or more of the cost of acquisition programs over their lifetime. So sustaining that closer to the fight, closer to the theater, is another way to benefit to build this allied approach to create this larger industrial base. All right, so to do this, there are certain things that kind of help enable or help us do this that are kind of existing or kind of emerging kind of areas that we'll talk about. We call these enablers. The first of these are subsidiaries that they already do a lot of business in the U.S. I mean, if you look, who won the Air Force trainer program? It was a Boeing Saab win. Who won the Navy frigate competition? Fincantieri Maritime Marine, right? So who are 3 of the teams for the OMFV program that are, 3 of the teams have a major non-U.S. Partner, So, and if you look at for instance, the competition report that DOD put out last year saying that we only have 3 producers of fighter jets and the fact of the matter is, that doesn't include any of these companies like BAE Systems or so on that have major U.S. subsidiaries or do major business in the U.S. So we've got a robust number of companies. There are 28 countries that have reciprocal defense procurement memorandums of understanding, or RDP-MOUs. And these are agreements to respect the procurement systems bilaterally of each country, and what it does for non-U.S. for companies that are from these countries, it exempts them from Buy America rules. All right. Security of supply arrangements. There are 13 of these now they're arrangements, not agreements. All right. So that's so the fact that none of these are about confidence building measures. The fact of the matter is none of these have ever been used, and that's, I would argue, because they're arrangements, not agreements. And so I have a recommendation on how to make those kind of more robust. And then here's Defense Exportability Features is a program that was started in 2013, I believe, and is about building exportability into the front end of a system. So for those of you all that build radars or advanced tech systems, if you build them for the U.S. forces, and then you have an idea that you want to sell them later internationally, what you have to do is you have to reverse engineer the technology to build in the anti-tamper and all these, the other technology issues. So DEF was intended to build that on the front end where it's much less expensive and bring in international partners at the front end. However, that thing has limped along for a long time at $10 million or less. But most recently, there's a promising way. There was $50 million put in the Ukraine supplemental that can breathe life into that. This is an important enabler going forward. The NTIB, well, we can thank Bill Greenwald for the National Technology Industrial Base, which is a long heritage. The U.S. and Canada have been the same industrial base since the early 90s under law. And in 2017 NDA, the Brits and the Aussies were added to that. And then last year, the Australians, the Kiwis were, the New Zealanders. So this is a great policy level document that has had, frankly, no impact on industrial cooperation, and that needs to change. AUKUS, the Australian, UK, and United States agreement, starts at a much stronger premise than the NTIB because it's about programs. It's about the Australian submarine program, and it's about Pillar 2, which is about advanced capabilities. So you're talking about programs on the start. Because an interesting thing is that we work really closely operationally with our allies and partners. I mean, we've got Brits and Aussies on our SIPRNet at CENTCOM and so on. But when it comes to tech, when it comes to kit, that's where we have the real challenges. All right. And the last one is this NATO Defense Innovation Accelerator, or DIANA, and also what Mr. LaPlante talked about this morning, the NATO, the Ukraine Contract Group, these kind of emerging efforts. All right, so you've got those enablers, but then you have some obstacles, and these are not permanent barriers, but they're things that need to be kind of overcome or streamlined. Export controls. I mean, the good news is that countries that we operate with closely, the export controls are generally can be overcome. It's a question of how can we do it faster to meet the speed that we need for today and tomorrow. So, and that's we'll talk about it in the recommendations. Same goes with technology security and foreign disclosure, or how we release a technology. These are some of the most classified, opaque reviews for anti-tamper, for low-clo, for crypto, and all kinds of reviews. And these are controlled mostly by DoD, but having those kind of proceed, this will be an important thing to show that they continue to move on these at a prompt pace. The defense acquisition system, here it's not really fair to call it an obstacle, but what it is that there aren't the defense acquisition system is about building technology for the U.S. warfighter, okay? And so it does have nods for international acquisition, partners and allies and so on. But the overwhelming requirement, I was talking with General Bassett earlier, as a program manager, is you got to maintain your cost, schedule, and performance, right? Really emphasis on cost. And one of the first things to go on the cutting room floor is, kind of advanced exportability or partnering with allies and so on. So, because you got to meet your cost and schedule. So there's ways we can make the system more effective to enable this build allied approach. And then finally, there's Buy America. There's been one of the things I saw in government and since is a real emphasis on reshoring, onshoring technology, and that's been really important, but it has also kind of exacerbated some desires to increase Buy America requirements on defense systems, which, is counterproductive on numerous levels I talk about in the paper. It's already defense is already one of the strongest kind of net export kind of areas in our economy, and the allies and partners, a lot of them are exempt from Buy America anyway. So, but it creates counterproductive in the dialogue with allies and partners, because at the same time, a lot of people that want more Buy America rules are also arguing that partners and allies should buy American kit. So, I mean, try selling that sales pitch is harder when you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. And this is not administrations do this on both sides of the aisle. All right, so to get after this, we looked at 9 cases, and we looked at 2 big ones, the F-35 and MRAP. Then we looked at 4 kind of bilateral or kind of focused efforts, Next Generation Jammer, AMRAAM. 3 Dealer, and Thor ER. And then we looked at 3 NATO programs. And here, the NATO ones are fascinating. You get the real gamut of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Well, actually, it's really the ugly and the good. So, all right. So, I'll get after each one of these. So, the F-35. So, F-35 is the largest program ever. All right. And those I don't know, did you work on the F-35? No, no.
We administer the contract.
Okay, all right. So those who have worked on the F-35 will tell you there's lots of years were lost, and it's really, really hard. I mean, it's a program where they negotiated the procurement, sustainment, and production, follow-on production MOU in 2009, I believe. They're very hard to do, and you have tremendous turbulence. You had the Canadians were in and out of the program. The Turks we kicked out. But the thing is a large program like this, it's very hard, but they're very sticky. And so right now you've got tremendous kind of, and they did negotiate that early on the stage for production. And a real benefit of you see in the F-35 is it builds in resilience and it grows the worldwide industrial base. If you look at the companies involved across the globe that are producing parts for the F-35, it's amazing. And then the thing I find most fascinating is if you look at the final assembly and checkout, where they're actually producing and rolling them on assembly line, we have two of those FACOs are not in the U.S. I mean, one's in Japan and one's in Italy. Right? And so not only do they do the final assembly checkout there, they also do sustainment. So you've got real opportunities there going forward. So all right. So I'm sorry, I'm going too long. So MRAP, so MRAP is not an international program, but the point here is that the leadership took this and said, this is incredible. We've got to move this, and they used an existing foreign design, brought it in, produced it commercially, and moved out. All right, and then looking at these, the bilateral ones, the point of all these programs was that they were focused efforts between the U.S. and a partner that had a mutual need and capability to either, and these are a lot of the Norwegians and the Australians and I think that's it, that were either developing a second source on AMRAAM motors or radars and so on, and this helped focus the partnership and set it up for future success. And then looking at the NATO programs, NATO AGS, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but anyone guess how many years it took from the communique decide the ministerial decision for AGS and IOC? 27 years. 27 years. So that's a very bad case for why you don't do multilateral cooperative development programs. They're extremely challenging. On the other hand, if you look at NATO's Sea Sparrow, it's a 60-year running program. We started with 4 countries, started small and paid off in the long run. And NATO tanker was even simpler. NATO tanker was 6 countries, got together, bought an existing tanker, and built that capability in. So in conclusion, we have the elements of a build-ally approach, and the key success drivers are departmental leadership, focused collaborative efforts, and effective use of enablers. And got to overcome to really kind of get where we need to be. We need to overcome these obstacles. We've got this support that has never been seen for these kind of efforts even on Capitol Hill, as well as in the administration in the Pentagon. And so I make a series of recommendations I'm not going to go through on specifically how we can do this in terms of defense acquisition system, the RDP MOU, strengthening them, DEF, and the NTIB, as well as AUKUS and TISFID. So, but I'll just stop there and we can get into Q&A.
Yeah, thanks. We have one final paper, and I'm not going to take any time here. I want to welcome Dr. Balakrishnan to the virtual stage to present her paper on sole source versus full and open competition and driving value for the money. Doctor?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, can you hear me?
I can.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And a very good evening here from Oxford. And without further ado, I'll go straight into the content of the paper. We have actually focused our research on critically analyzing the factors that could influence and determine tendering methods in government contracting with the aim of delivering value for money. Next slide, please. So what were the motivations for this research? This is actually a research in progress. Competitive tendering has been the gold standard for government procurement contracts. So this is the practice drummed into the procurement practitioners in line with the measurement of money, efficiency, and effectiveness that aligns to value for money principles. However, from our research, we have evidence that there has been an increasing trend in single source contracts as opposed to competitive bid. And our paper provides data from the UK National Audit Office, as well as other reports and research papers on the growing trend in terms of sole sourcing. The numbers have also dramatically increased since COVID-19, and we were able to get public data from reports in the UK, US, Europe, but not from other countries around the world. The published data on single source versus competitive bid is still not transparent for many governments around the world. The second reason why we wanted to undertake this research is that with the hope that this paper would adopt both a qualitative and quantitative method, which produce empirically based evidence outcome for defense procurement officials who often are confused by the choice of tendering methods due to the inability to decide on tendering choices that can result in costly, inefficient, and not delivering value for money. So there is lack of research within the defense acquisition community to empirically justify the rationale for the choices and decide on the factors that should be considered in deciding the choice of tendering method. The third reason is that public procurement, especially in the defense sector, is still very under-researched due to the lack of access for academics to access data, lack of government involvement in the process, and the fact that the facts on defense is often deemed sensitive. Also, such research is believed to support with creating a more efficient and effective defense public procurement outcome. And the outcome in this particular research, which will be a framework, is hoped to be a generalizable to the context of other countries around the world to inform best practices and savings for defense procurement value for money. Next slide, please. So we developed the research question based on the following. First, we identified seminal work and other journal papers and articles that were relevant to public procurement in defense, value for money, and types of tendering in public procurement, such as single sourcing, restricted sourcing, as also competitive bid. We used keyword search for the sources from various public platforms, including from the University of Warwick, NCORE search engine, and other online databases. And the main paper that we looked at closely for our own work was that by Duddy B, Londici, and Kretschel J.A. 2020, Delivering Capability to Competition in Defense Contracting, Does Policy Drive Result, which was a Defense AR Journal, paper volume 27. And at the same time, authors practice, especially my own practice as in the Ministry of Defense, involved in procurement activities and being exposed to the tender processes and bidding challenges were useful to influence and confirm the theory and deductive findings from the literature sources. We are still in progress in terms of finding more secondary materials, as there's not much research done in this area from a quantitative and qualitative perspective. So based on the steps above, we came up with the following research question. What are the factors that determine the most appropriate method for tendering that delivers the best value for money in defense procurement? Next slide, please. Based on the research question, we developed 4 research objectives for this paper. First, to define the features of defense procurement and government contracts. And we achieved this objective, and the paper defines the concepts and of defense procurement and argues the differences between public procurement as well as acquisition. To critically evaluate the cost and benefits of the different contracting methods, we partially achieved this objective. We believe that there may be further material that could enhance this section, and we need to undertake further, and also this will be enhanced through fieldwork on data collection. Third, to analyze the challenges for the current processes in determining defense contracting processes. We believe this objective has only been partially achieved because we need to undertake fieldwork and data collection to further enhance this section. And finally, to develop a framework that could be used to determine the choice of tendering for defense procurement contract. And this is a work in progress because we have only developed a hypothetical framework that now needs to be tested for its reliability based on the data that we aim to collect. Next slide, please. In terms of the research design will take a pragmatic approach and will focus on the real world problem and challenges. We have employed a multi-method approach, which will rely on qualitative as well as quantitative data. Data collection will include literature research, journals, reports to develop the framework, and a structured questionnaire with Likert scales will be developed and be distributed to defense procurement stakeholders in the government and industry to obtain primary data. And this will be added to an open-ended questionnaire, which will be distributed to few key government and industry officials involved in procurement and tender. The reason for that we have not decided on whether we would confine the study to the UK environment only, or we will open this to other contexts as well, and this will depend on the number of the access to data and sample population that we will be able to gather. So the questions that we will undertake will be clustered into 3 parts. We will be looking at the cost and benefits of contracting methods. What are the challenges to the current process? And finally, what are the factors that will determine the tender processes? And these factors will be ranked to obtain a hierarchy of preference and to determine the key factors. The aim is to capture other factors, if there are, that may be left out in the literature through the data collection method. And the questionnaire will be distributed using Qualtrics method online, and the data will be captured using Excel spreadsheet and analyzed for quantitative numbers and content, and a thematic analysis will be done to validate the arguments on the qualitative side on the variables and determine the tender process choices. So the unit of analysis will be mainly those involved in defense procurement and tendering processes, either from the armed forces, government and industry who are engaged in government tendering and bid processes. We are looking at around 50 participants through a random sample population, and another 10 questionnaires which will be distributed to selected officials in this specific environment. And the research will compare the secondary literature argument with the primary data to validate for the reliability of the framework. Ethical standards and compliance to research ethics will be followed to ensure non-disclosure of participants' identity in line with the UK GDPR. And we may use LinkedIn to capture data in terms of participants who will volunteer. Next slide, please. I won't go too detailed into the literature review because the paper does explain in detail in terms of the advantages and disadvantages between sole sourcing and competitive tendering. But what I would like to highlight is that there are various challenges and advantages and disadvantages, but on the whole, the sole sourcing strategy is often the preferred choice if a partner wants to go in, build a long-term relationship, build trustworthiness, and in terms of looking at cooperation and building a strong relationship between the buyer and supplier, as opposed to a competitive tendering, which is more transactional. It's looking at economic efficiency and also in terms of price competitiveness and product quality and so on. So next slide, please. So based on the literature review, we identified 7 determinants as factors that may influence the tendering processes and the choice of tendering. And these are mentioned in the framework. These include cost, technology, culture, reliability, security and sovereignty, alliances and relationship, and standards. We have not been able to look at them in terms of the preference and hierarchy, because this we will need further investigation into the data collection to determine the key factors. So the aim will be next to validate the factors and determine whether there are other factors that have been left out in terms of capturing all of the factors and to identify which are the factors that primarily influence a single source versus competitive bid, and to be able to modify and further refine the framework for a more accurate delivery. In terms of limitations, obviously, we foresee limitations in terms of access to data, especially the number of participants who will be open to being involved in the interviews, as well as a timeline and to collect the data. So thank you for listening, and I hope the presentation have provided some insights into defense procurement tendering methods. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Balakrishnan. I think we have time for one question, only if we go into your break. Sir, please.
Hello, thank you. I'm Major General Dada from Nigerian Army. I was looking at the successes and failure based on the case studies that were highlighted. And what are the reasons why the United States has not been able to have such capacity over the last 1 year of the Ukrainian problem? Is it has to do with the policy? I believe that the essence of this symposium is to know what can be done. But I was thinking from those of us coming from that part of the world that by now we should be able to have some capacity surge, looking at the number of alliances. But from what has been said during your research, I think you are still having some challenges to that. So what do you think is a problem? It's important we know so that for those of us from that part of the world, we'll be able to know how to mitigate it in the future. Thank you, sir.
Okay, by the way, I misspoke. I think we have 30 minutes for questions. I think I got the timeline wrong, and I wanted to take questions, and it's not like I cut them short. So y'all bring it. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I had trouble understanding your question, but I think it was around what are the obstacles to really kind of doing strong cooperation on production programs. Is that fair? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think what my case studies, what our case studies showed is that the industrial collaboration can happen. It requires really, really strong leadership. It has to be ideally led by a specific country. Like look at NATO AGS, it was as a group effort, which is always bad. Whereas JSF was a U.S.-led program, and so it was. So you need that. And you also need to focus on the areas, the bilateral programs that we looked at. They were specific areas like next generation jammer, ramjet, on hypersonics. And so you had a strong alignment of interest and technologies, and then they made, investments together. And then the other thing is, I think there needs to be, we can be successful on these, but I think we need more emphasis on speed. So that means how do we improve and expedite how we do export control reviews, how we do technology disclosure release. These are U.S. kind of challenges, but they're critically important to meet the real challenges to build the long-term capacity, and also practical things like international cooperative co-production agreements, and even getting things on contract. It takes a long time, and those kind of efforts need more leadership attention to really help drive them. Because I think the MRAP case shows that if it's really darn important, you can get it done. But it shouldn't require the Secretary of Defense to be the program manager. But but that kind of if it's that important to the department, then it's the kind of thing that needs to happen. One of my recommendations, which I'm sorry I kind of didn't get to go through, was that the deputy secretary, the National Defense Strategy, the Dr. Plant, they've talked about allies and partners a lot. But what they need to do is they need to get specific, and I would recommend that the deputy secretary sign out a memo to the entire acquisition workforce, saying that working with allies and partners is priority, and that means, and specifically highlighting the importance of RDP MOUs, about DEF, and about NTIB and AUKUS, so you can break through some of these cultural barriers. And a lot of these are, most of these are not kind of intentional. It's just, if you're working at Picatinny, you're not working in the Pentagon. It's just a very different world. You have very different set of incentives. So we have to align those better. Likewise, for the program managers of the world and the program executive offices, they're not evaluated on how well they cooperate with partners and allies. There's none of that. And even though some of them do, like half their business is FMS or direct commercial sales, that's not an evaluation factor for that PEO. Why is it not? Why isn't it how you do that? So, because the things you measure are the things that you can succeed on. Anyway, I hope that answers your question.
I guess one thing I'd like to add to that too is that in peacetime, the incentives are very different for every nation involved, and I think when you're looking at peacetime partnerships, often what a nation will prioritize is their own industrial capacity, their own national interests. And so when you approach it from that angle, sometimes the international partnerships are all about what production can I get in my country, right? And then how, and in order to gain consensus, who's ever sort of running that has to give concessions to everyone. I think what you end up with would be an industrial strategy no one country would have ever come up with on their own, and I think it also contributes to some of the very long timelines that the doctor here had described in his paper, that some of these NATO partnerships would take, decades, and consensus takes time. It takes trust, and oftentimes it will span multiple political administrations with different political goals. I was the program manager in 2012 for the Army's. It was actually a joint program, the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. And when we started, we had the Australian Army as a partner, and we had them deeply embedded into our program office. We had officers assigned to our team. We were using them, say, as functional leads. My C5 ISR lead was actually an Australian officer, and when it came time to getting their commitment to become partners for production, they went with a national program because their incentive was to be able to build the capacity to build those vehicles in their own nation. And so when I look from where I sit today, looking at global production at times, some of the most successful programs, and I'm going to put Joint Strike Fighter as internationally a very successful program. There were, I think, the steps that they took to, say, put an integration facility in Camari in Italy, and then another one in Japan, and now each nation is sort of, I'll say, working towards establishing sustainment capabilities in their own country. We see that sort of competition for where that work will be done globally. That has created the kind of long-term partnerships that are successful, but it doesn't happen overnight. And you have to go into it realizing that if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, you go together. And it's I think programs like that will show that you can go far together, but it may be a little slower. Thanks. Next question, please.
Hi, thank you for your time and for the interesting panel. I'm Mark Timnitsky. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and a project controls analyst with ERIC within ANS. So I think as many of us know, in July, the NATO countries are coming together, and I was wondering if you could be in the room with those defense ministers. How would you address the supply chain idea, et cetera, knowing that they'll be focusing a lot of their time on China and Russia? So thank you.
Do you want me to take that? Or you want to take it? So I think we're really in an interesting sort of environment right now, sort of post-COVID, as folks have begun to recover from the COVID-related supply chain disruptions. I think a strong NATO starts with individual nation states contributing significant military capability. And so it does start with that national responsibility and their contribution to the NATO alliance. And so I guess the connection between the two things is that now is the time to not take those supply chains for granted. And normally I'm used to talking to industry and not nation states. But from where I sit in my current position, I would say that the solution to keeping supply chains moving in difficult times is not treating your supply chain as something that doesn't need to be tended to. That, you know, we used to be, I think, prior to COVID, some companies got complacent, that they could use very few resources in their supply chain and the parts would magically show up because it was his supply chain was vibrant and healthy. And I think a lot of companies are now realizing what they need is something closer to supply chain intimacy, where they do not just treat their supply chain partners as external organizations, but something that they have to be more closely partnered with. That's a terrible message, by the way, for the NATO allies. Not just in the sense that it's more of a message for industry than for governments. But partnerships matter. I'd say from a NATO perspective, we can take a page out of Benjamin Franklin's book when he said that we must all hang together, or most assuredly we'll hang separately. Well, it's time for NATO to hang together and to push back on the global aggression we've seen.
Yeah, I would kind of echo that, and I think the biggest message I would give to partners and allies is, you know, finding common solutions quickly is most important. So I mean, so instead of customization of capabilities, you know, finding common kind of solutions where good enough is good enough, and because it's more important to build the capacity than it is to kind of negotiate the perfect work share.
I would just add that I think there's a need to push some bias and emphasis toward upstream dependencies in certain supply chains. So as we think about the capacity as a surge for Ukraine, there are certain energetics and materials that neither us nor our allies are generating at the necessary capacity that are eventually feeding into slowdowns in our ability to surge. That's not the same story in every supply chain, but I think disproportionately we do have far upstream dependencies and challenges that we need to work with our allies quickly to resolve, both to keep production running, also to offset the deterrent capacity and vulnerability that we have right now if our dependence is tied to one of our primary near-peer threats. But we do also need to be honest about other supply chains. So if you look at semiconductors, we have a challenge at the far upstream where we don't create any gallium and we get 90% of it from China. We also have at the downstream nodes dependencies in terms of packaging and testing. We can generate things here in new fabs in the United States, but if we still have to ship them to China to get packaged before they can go into a subsystem, that's still a dependency. So we need to be honest about the different nodes and different supply chains. I think that critical minerals is one area where NATO partners and others involved in critical security initiatives launched, relaunched, reformed over the past 3-5 years is one example where I think our partners can prove their value, and that's a story where we sometimes have upstream problems, but we've gotten good about extracting things in new and different places, and we've also gotten a little bit better but still have real vulnerabilities in terms of downstream processing capacity, whether that's metal alloys or it's feeding things into actual subsystems. So I think being honest amongst our trusted allies and partners about the actual dependencies we have across nodes and value chains.
Can I build on that? So, I mean, and this is where a couple of the enablers that I haven't had a chance to talk about kind of can really help. These SOSAs, security of supply arrangements, they're these generic kind of arrangements. But if we focus them instead on where there's a bilateral kind of area where, there's a competitive advantage of, say the Norwegians or the Brits with, that is a focus area of security of supply, be that materials or chemicals or something like that, rocket motors. Right? Likewise for NTIB, for NTIB to really get legs, what it needs to do is get kind of real. It gets real practical. So the U.S. and Canada right now are a part of one industrial base, so all Defense Production Act Title III solicitations are open to countries based in the U.S. and Canada, right? So there's no reason why we shouldn't expand that to include all NTIP countries. I know Congress considered that last year, and they're actively considering it this year. So they're, because surprise, surprise, the Canadians and Australians have really competitive advantages in mining. They do tremendous, we're only place outside of China that does significant rare earth processing is in Australia. So you've got, those kind of capabilities, you could, you've got a ready vehicle there in the EdTem. Let's kind of make it more practical. Let's set defarce clauses that can, that make it more knowable to contracting officers and acquisition professionals, and so those kind of activities. So,
Can I just add on the topic as well, if it's okay? I think, working with businesses, I realized that security and geopolitical considerations are one, but then the market actually does not respond or move in that direction, because the market still sources for where the products are the cheapest, and they will go for that kind of solutions, and as opposed to putting money into resilience. So this has been some of my observations from looking at how supply chains are reacting to the recent issues, especially security of supply chain.
Thank you. Next question.
Good afternoon. My name is Jason Wigginton. I am a quality assurance specialist with Defense Contract Management Agency. There was a statement made by, help me pronounce her name correctly, Dr.
Balakrishnan.
Balakrishnan, that the sole source is the preferred way to go in terms of acquisition versus competitive. Was consideration for process failures and various forms of manufacturing, manpower on a regional basis, considerations, and then, of course, the sub-tier suppliers. And then, in addition to that, how would these affect surge capacity? Should these raise their heads as a problem? And what risks were considered? Thank you.
I suppose there are three parts to this question. So if I'm not mistaken, the first part of the question is asking me about the different considerations to sole sourcing, whether I was looking at sole source as part of the preferred choice. So just to answer that part of the question, it is not a matter of looking at sole source as the preferred choice, but looking at which type of tendering method would be the preferred. What are the factors that would be the preferred choice for the different tendering methods, and then looking at how these factors, ranking those factors into the sole sourcing versus restricted and competitive tendering. So that was the objective of this particular research. I didn't really get the initial the different variables that was being mentioned by the person who was questioning, but he was talking about surge capacity. So in terms of the surge capacity, I have not really thought through that specific element in the research. The risk factors have also obviously much higher in the sole sourcing environment, where we're looking at factors like how sole sourcing will actually undermine innovation and creativity. Sole sourcing could increase the price of the contract. Sole sourcing could obviously reduce the leverage especially for the buyer, as they may not have the additional leverage to seek, for example, industrial work, industrial participation, or offsets, better offsets package. They may not be able to negotiate for a better price, so they'll be locked into specific technical specifications. So those are the disadvantages or the risks that we had looked at, as opposed to the other method of competitive tendering in terms of risk. So I'm sorry I didn't get the first part of the question. If that can be repeated, I'm happy to answer that. Thank you.
Sure. What I was referring to as some of these variables would be process failures at a sole source, or manpower issues at that sole source, which can be varied according to region.
Is the point that you're saying that those should be factors that should be considered in whether to go sole source or fully competitive, and where would it help me out?
That is my point. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the additional factors that have been introduced, especially the process failures and manpower factor. I think one of the elements that obviously can be included is how the acquisition process itself can influence sole sourcing versus competitive tendering. So that's a very good point, and I'll take that into consideration in the research.
One thing I'll add on that is I'm going to go back to a program that I run that had a lot of fully open competition built in. In fact, it was a full and open competition for production, and then again, where the government had bought the design. This was the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. The government bought the design and recompeted production after a 5-year production period. It's in litigation, so I don't want to say too much. I just will make the point that I have nothing to do with the source selection, so anything I say has had no effect on the ongoing litigation. But there are some one-time costs associated with that I think have to be considered. And so if you have an active production line with employees that are trained, that you get to the point of what I've described as kind of dialed-in production, right? The parts are there, they know what they're doing, you're getting a consistent result. Reopening to full and open competition, potentially to a whole new location with a new company, with all of the risks associated with that recompete. I think that's something we have to get our head around. And I might have helped come up with the strategy in the first place, but I'm not certain that the one-time costs and disruption might necessarily, that's a pretty significant risk and something that has to be considered. But again, I realize I'm talking about something that's active, and again, I have absolutely no influence on that source selection. Sorry. Next question, please.
Hi, Bill Greenwald with the American Enterprise Institute. One comment on Jerry's paper and a question for Nate. And Jerry, I think you know that the NTIB, one of the congressional ideas behind that was to try to force ITAR reform. Absolute failure in doing that. And so this week I'll be putting out a paper on AUKUS and prospects for ITAR reform. And right now, if I was going to summarize the paper, it's in academia, so it's not going to say this, but AUKUS is on the cusp of failure because of ITAR, and we haven't quite got our arms around that. But so I think what you're doing there is absolutely the right thing, and those are the right issues to be looking at. But Nate, I've got a question for you. The Chinese deep tech investments, the problem we have in the U.S. with VC investments or VC adoption of technology is the venture private sector community gets to capability very fast and gets it out in the market very fast. And the U.S. government, when it sees those types of capabilities, is very slow to adopt it. In your research, did you see anything to indicate that the Chinese are doing this better than we are? In other words, are they taking VC deep tech technology and adopting it faster into their defense technology, because that's really the race of the future. And because we're doing a terrible job of it. We are not bringing in what is being produced in the commercial marketplace at scale and quickly enough. Are the Chinese doing this any better, or are we essentially at the same level?
Yeah, that's a great and determinative question, I think, so thank you. I think there's some degree of evidence that they are doing it better, which I think owes in part to their technology strategy in the first place. So they've been stealing and applying technology from commercial or non-Chinese sources for 30 years post ITRMA. So they have a pretty well-worn process. Where this is then reflected in the way that their private market investments are different than ours is that it's impossible to start an investment fund that's it's impossible to start an investment fund point blank in China without having an investment mandate that is tied to the strategic emerging industries. So they're baking into the investment thesis of every single private market fund that they have in their country a need to be tied to the prescribed goals of the state, which are tied to the economic development objectives, certainly, but also to the modernization needs of their military. That's quite a chasm from, the types of investment mandates that we see in the United States. So it follows, I think, that we should expect they're going to perform a little bit better on this metric. That's not to say that the rest of their acquisition system works any better or differently than ours. There's a lot of mimicry in the way they go about how they're structuring acquisition, as well as the things they're trying to produce. And the one thing that I would flag as a potential solve from the American system is that we're not going to be able to replicate the state intervention and guidance that occurs in the shaping of investment funds that China has. The thing that we can do is develop backward from concepts of operations a better approach that allows us to apply and scale within the garden of our protected defense ecosystem better than they can. There's not a ton of evidence yet that they're doing that better. There's some evidence in cyber and in UAS deployments that it's possible they're doing this better than we are or could. But that's where, if we're doing smart things in the acquisition community, smart things in the concept development space, I think that's where our advantage could possibly lie.
I will add that it's probably worth revisiting how they may be thinking about risk and accepting risk differently. If you look at the employment of UAVs in Ukraine, they're largely operating in a sort of completely unencrypted, sort of wide open manner that frankly we would never allow. And so historically, I'll say we are so worried about what the test report will say that our willingness to allow less than perfect solutions isn't very good. And we've seen this as we go on to take on this advanced technology, that it may work well enough if we were fighting, but because we're not, we won't take it on. I think active protection has been a perfect example of that. The US Army held out for years for a perfect active protection system for our tanks, and watched some of our allies actually develop significantly more capable systems because it didn't have to be perfect for them to put it on. In the end, we put it on too. And so, I kind of reject the notion, I don't think I've seen it, that the Chinese have done better at adopting these kinds of advanced technologies. But I think if they do, we ought to be looking at the way in which they will operationally accept risk in a less than perfect solution, and whether we're willing to do the same thing. Because as of right now, we get an annual report from DOT&E that insists on near perfection before we're allowed to employ capabilities, and that shapes our culture. I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. So a quick comment and the transition to a question. So for Dr. Balakrishnan, I'd say, I did not see in your paper, but one area to highlight might be whether there are multiple domestic sources available. I think there often will be multiple international sources, but in the US at least, we sometimes have competition with only a single offer. And I think often a contracting officer would prefer to use non-sole source methods because they might have more versatility there. That actually transitions to my question. How important do you think competition is as a mechanism for getting greater national cooperation? Is that an area where things like modular open systems have a lot of potential, where the Army approach you mentioned, Jerry, in the case study, Is there a model we should use more? Or is it often going to come down to deliberately identifying this is something our countries both want to do together, let's put together an SM3-2A or the like, where it's more leadership attention and not necessarily let's just put it out there and see what comes?
Very much. I think that's a very great question, and I hope I'm able to provide the answer for it. I think it all depends on the context of each collaboration. I think this is where I would probably take the presentations from both the participants in terms of collaboration versus going individual, where each country has got its own recipe in terms of what makes a successful international procurement program, and the context, the geopolitical context, but also the requirements for the capability in country, and the cultural context within the country, and the acquisition process and system would determine whether the challenges around it will push for a competitive or collaborative kind of environment for procurement. And I'm going to be very honest and say that there will not be a single recipe for either a country would want to go for a competitive procurement for all kind of products, air, sea, land, or a collaborative product or systems or service for in another environment. It would have to be a basket of goods that they would want to adapt, and this would very much depend also on the foreign policy and defense policy dimension in terms of looking at their alignment with the different countries and how they want to work with their allies or partners or friendly countries. So the various factors and determinants will eventually move towards identifying the right process and ecosystem for how the international defense procurement will work for a single country. So that would be my take on it.
So thank you very much. We are out of time. I want to thank this fantastic panel and the papers that were submitted. So thank you, Jerry and Nate and Dr. Balakrishnan. I didn't get to every single panel all day, but I'm confident this was the best one yet. So again, thank you very much.